Hey, how's it going everyone? This is OddJob here. In today's video, I want to try something a little different, which is I want to add a little bit of commentary to the Reverse the Verse episodes that are coming out weekly. In this particular case, we are talking about rest stops, and I have a lot of thoughts on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a snippet of the actual RTV episode, and then I'm going to add some commentary based on what they're talking about. Again, this is brand new. Give me some feedback on it if you like it or not, if it's too long or too short, but let's go ahead and give this a try.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Reverse the Verse Live. This time featuring the Rest Stop Futures with with two members of our lore team. Immediately to my right, we've got narrative director, Mr. Dave Haddock.
Hello.
And immediately to my left, we've got lead writer, Mr. Will Weisbaum. One of the things that we're working on, and you'll see a little bit about it later on in ATV, is an explosion, an expansion of our modular rest stop systems. Change their design and evolve their design, make more modular elements, make them more visually unique, and stuff like that. I know Eddie Hilditch is doing some great R&D right now with new shapes and a new shape language for these things.
Now, one of the things that they're talking about is that they're going to go ahead and make the exteriors different, but they don't really go into how they're going to make the exterior different and what type of, I guess, inputs that they should actually feed in before actually building out the exterior. And what I want to say here is that they should definitely try to make this as dynamic as possible. In other words, when the rest stop is actually built, put in place. So for example, if they see an abundant amount of auroras, so this would represent a beginner area, the outside of the station should actually morph and be accommodating to small crafts like the aurora so that more people can get into the station, and therefore it actually is very utilitarian. It's something that would actually happen in real life, right? Because you cater to your customer so that if your customer is actually people with small crafts stopping at your rest stop, then you should morph it into something that caters to that customer. Now, take for example, if this is a more of a trading rest stop, you see a lot of whole C's, whole D's, whole E's, what have you, a lot of big cargo ships, then we should actually have more ship to station docking areas in which larger transport aircraft can actually dock to the station, do what they need to do, and fly off. So in terms of dynamic design, it should definitely morph to the type of demographics that's showing up to the space station. And as the game evolves and as the traffic changes, the exterior should slowly change with the game, with the demographic. That would make it true to life and something that's very representative of a space simulator. Now, having said all of that, that would also be extremely difficult to implement. It's not something that I expect right away, but I certainly hope the end goal is to try to do something like that, because that would be very representative of a very dynamic environment that's really keeping track of the demographic and the whole ecosystem that's actually revolving around it.
Talking with Ian and Eddie and the design team and stuff, they were basically like, we're looking for a couple more variations as far as like companies, brands type thing, just to kind of add some variety and some flavor too. We were kind of talking with them about what kind of parameters they had for us and stuff like that. But are there any things that you can kind of rule out immediately that would help guide us to make sure that the stuff that we're generating fulfills your guys' needs as well as what makes sense for the universe? And could we come up with sort of a higher end luxury version company or station type and more of a lower end one?
And that's usually the kind of approach we take, is the high, middle, low. It gives us a good breadth, at least for a first pass of.
So in this clip right here, they're already talking about high-end, low-end, and mid-range stations and kind of what they actually envision it to be. Now, I understand that this is designed to be entertaining, so they just really want to get right into the context of it. But I feel like for this particular clip, they're putting the cart before the horse, meaning that they're already designing a station when they haven't really talked about the demographic that they're trying to serve. If I were to take a real world example and a rest stop in the real world, when a company actually goes in to design a rest stop, they first actually look at the demographic that they're serving, and then they can actually figure out whether or not it's a high, low, or mid-range station. Because what you need to do is you need to see what type of demographic is actually in that area and how much money they're willing to spend. So an example of this is, say that this is a coal mining area. So you're going to have a lot of blue collar workers and there's going to be a lot of manual labor. For that type of demographic, what is the low end, what is the middle end, and what is the high end? Because it's going to change depending on the demographic they serve. Now, if we talk about, say, a rest station between Crusader and ArcCorp, you're going to have a lot more engineers, you're going to have a lot more managers, CEOs. These type of people, when it comes to low, medium, and high, they're going to have a completely different station. When it comes to a station that's catering more to the white collars, so people that aren't doing manual labor jobs, it's probably going to be more geared towards electronics, make sure they're powering all their devices, have room to actually have meetings. These are the fundamental things that are going to be different between the stations. What we really need to do is look at the demographic that's going to be represented inside Star Citizen. From there, we can actually plan out what type of stations would cater to them. This is something that's fundamentally important, and it's something that could be super interesting because fundamentally speaking, if there is a high traffic area where you have coal miners, traders, engineers, and CEOs all coming together, you could potentially see multiple stations at one rest stop. In other words, there's going to be multiple options and you can actually decide which rest stop you want to go into because they're going to be catering to different demographics, and in general those demographics don't really mingle well together. So what you should see is a mini floating flotilla which caters to all of the demographics. Therefore there's different competition between each other and there's going to be its own little mini ecosystem working in that particular area that would make gameplay super interesting, especially if players can actually own stations. There's now going to be a hyper localized competition and gameplay that's going on there. I can definitely spend a whole bunch of time talking about all these theories, but let's go ahead and move on to the next clip.
So we have our initial notes that we kind of took down from meeting with the art team and kind of bullet points to keep in mind of when we're going forward. A few years ago, it was all about the fuel stations, about how were ships going to refuel in space. And so some of you might remember an old portfolio where we wrote up all these companies. We had CTR, we had Fuel Pump, Cryastro, and Cryastro we had in game for a while, where you would go there, you would land and be able to refuel and repair. But then along the way, it started talking about, well, we want people to get out of their ships more, we want them to have more of experience, have this collection of these shops. And that's when we started developing R&R. We came up with all this branding for what these rest stops were going to be.
Gas stations now start to have more and more amenities, particularly if you're doing kind of highway travel and stuff like that, where they'll have a little deli, sometimes a full restaurant, that type of thing. So it's like, it's off the cuff. It seemed to make sense that Cryastro could be a potential candidate to throw out there.
So for this particular section, I actually cut it down because they went into some details and some debate about shops and what should and shouldn't be in there. A lot of what they're talking about makes a lot of sense if this was an actual real universe. Unfortunately, we're talking about a video game in which players want to play a video game. And a lot of these shops, nobody's really going to go into them because they're going to be generic and they can take care of it in one go. And it's usually going to be probably on one of the planets rather than midway through a station. So what I'm trying to say here is, yes, there should definitely be shops that are fleshed out more for the NPCs, but unfortunately, we really need more shops that are geared towards players playing a video game. In other words, there should be a reason why you should land there and want to find out stuff. So what we should be talking about are amenities that fit into the station, but is also very useful to the players that's just there for a short amount of time. Things like gathering information, mini quests, getting small buffs for either the player or the actual aircraft they're in, things that are actually relevant to the player and its current gameplay right now, reasons why the player wants to stop there. Otherwise, when it comes to shops like clothing shops and also component shops, they've probably already done that and they don't really need to do that again for lengthy periods of time, especially shops that are going to be at stations, because you're not going to get anything special out of them. As a player, you're going to be min-maxing a lot, which means you're going to be looking for the absolute best components, and I don't think you're going to be finding that at the rest stops. This is the reason why in one of my core theory crafts about fully persistent ships, which I'll link to the video below, but the concept is that certain ships should be fully persistent even if the player logs out. And the example that I want to give here is the Banu Merchantman, in which there should be specific pads designed for Banu Merchantmen so that when they land, they're going to be fully persistent there. And the rest stops could be like an armistice area in which, there's no fighting. So a merchantman can land, a player can log out. All of a sudden, when players come into that rest stop, they see the merchantman, they might decide to stop there just to see what type of goods are on the merchantman. Why? Because it's a player-owned ship, and players are going to be min-maxing, which means they're going to be looking for specific items that players are interested in, not NPC shops in which their items are going to be more generic and more standardized, which no player really wants to buy those things anyway. So they can go to the merchantman, see if there's actually some interesting things in there, maybe sell off components that they have that they don't need anymore. And this goes into my other core gaming theory, which is we need an ecosystem in which we can easily trade between players. Again, I'll put a link below on this. Basically, what I said in that video is that there must be a mechanism in which players can trade with each other when they're not online. This will allow more player-to-player interaction, which gives them more authority, which makes the universe feel a lot more real because there's going to be true interaction between players, not interaction between a player and an NPC. Yes, there should be stores that are fleshed out that are more geared towards the NPCs, but we also need stores that are specifically geared towards players, because if it's just all generic shops or just the need to pick up more fuel, most players are just going to ignore the station altogether. So all of this work that they put in on these rest stops, they're largely going to be unused.
The Banu would have these sort of like space station marketplaces in space where people would congregate to trade and stuff like that. And it would be interesting, again, once we kind of start visually diving more into the Banu to figure out like, are there design elements or visual cues that we can incorporate from their designs to kind of insinuate that like, humanity sort of absorbed that influence into their thing, into how they build stations and stuff like that. Because we do have that sort of symbiosis between the cultures where it's like everyone's kind of like feeding off of each other and
So this particular clip was actually super interesting. Unfortunately, we don't really know enough about the alien races and also the interaction that they have with the humans for me to really comment on that. But it did spark a different idea in my head, which is we don't really have enough trade ships inside the Star Citizen universe. Right now, we only have the Banu Merchantman, and it's only geared towards more of a bazaar feel, a place where you're going to find used goods or trinkets or specialized equipment. We actually need other ships that maybe are more high-tech traders or more low-tech traders. There definitely needs to be more ships that are geared towards trading, just like the Banu Merchantman. I just really quickly wanted to throw that idea out there because it just kind of popped into my head.
So maybe something to think about before we go through like assigning out the actual owner of the station is kind of that experience thing.
For everybody who spent the last 55 minutes asking if players are going to get to own their own space station, stuff like that, I want to say that's a game design question and not something that's decided by members of the lore team here.
Can I go ahead and make some promises?
No?
and drop some dates.
Because you're not the one that gets in trouble for that. It's me.
Okay, so for the entire episode, this is probably the most interesting part or the most exciting thing to hear. Now, we already know that one of the funding goals was that players are going to be allowed some interaction with the stations, whether it's to manage them, own them, or build them. We don't really know any specifics on that. But in this particular clip, I think the lore team is really on board with players being able to own stations. And count me as a player that's super interested in that, because one of my favorite games of all time, and I still play it every once in a while, is SimCity, in which case you can actually build out your own city. But in this particular case, we can actually build out our own space station, or maybe have a chain of space stations that we can own and manage. I think that is a brilliant idea. I would love to do something like that in the Star Citizen universe. In fact, for me, I think I would love that idea more than flying around in a spaceship. This would be entirely new gameplay, and it would be more towards the SimCity type games, which would be super cool to have inside of Star Citizen. And I really hope that it gains gains traction, and we actually start seeing some ideas flushed out on how players can own, build, manage space stations, and what their interaction is going to be with the rest of the universe. And again, just harping back on what I said earlier, which is that high traffic areas, mainstream areas, there should be more than one station in one particular spot because it's going to cater to multiple demographics. There should be competition there so that there could be really interesting gameplay in that area alone, because it's competition on trying to draw in the customer, which means that players that are flying into rest stop areas, they're not going to see multiple options, and there can be competitive pricing. There could be some really interesting gameplay in terms about corporate espionage. Again, going back to some of my theory crafting videos, this particular one is talking about different game modes, in which case you as the player can play for a larger organization, and they're actually having you manage their station. So in this particular scenario, you're playing for a larger corporation. They're giving you quests much like an RPG would, and you're completing these quests to actually dive into the storyline. There definitely can be a lot of interesting storylines that come from that, and because you're working for a larger organization, it's really just quests coming into your Moby Glass, and that's going to go ahead and extend the storyline on the type of gameplay that you're doing. So again, a lot of interesting gameplay can come from this, and I really hope they spend the time to flesh this out.
We're also the idea is that we would also be able to do mom and pop stations down the road as well, that this is Jared's rest stop that isn't tied into this bigger company, isn't part of the conglomerate, it just has weird stuff and it's a little random station.
Now, this particular idea is super interesting, in which it kind of dives into the same idea that players should be able to create their own small little rest stops. That would be super interesting. Maybe we can have a variant of the Pioneer in which it's specifically designed to actually build space stations rather than outposts. That would be something that would be super interesting, especially when that spacecraft is going to be super hard to implement. Let's go ahead and actually have a few variants in which it can actually build other things. That way some of those assets can be reused, but hopefully they'll flesh that out some more and give us some more details on that. But I'm super interested in actually having smaller outposts, building smaller outposts, and perhaps owning spaceships that can build these outposts.
Chat's been asking about things like Idrises and Javelins and stuff docking at some of these. You know, obviously those are civilian commissioned versions of those ships, but where would military ships? Are there military rest stops? Are there like Air Force bases? I guess.
There are military.
I would assume there would
stations.
be military stations that
They run the security operations for the system or something. There'll be a naval base, but this would tie into like kind of the reputation system stuff that we've been talking about now, where eventually you would do enough missions to earn a reputation as like a Navy contractor to be able to dock and refuel at these places. I wouldn't expect just because you own an Idris that they would be like, yeah, park up.
Exactly,
inside
not a
and-
military station. Absolutely not.
Of course, when it comes to the Star Citizen community, we're going to get right back into military and fighting, because that's one of the major gameplay elements that we can do right now. But it is a super interesting topic in which there is actually going to be military stations, and we are actually going to see them inside, I guess, UEE space, which makes a whole lot of sense because that area is supposed to be patrolled, and if you do anything bad, the law system would kick in, and I assume ships will come out of these bases and kind of try to track you down. So there is at least thought about how this is actually going to be work instead of just having UEE ships just appear out of nowhere. But the interesting thing to talk about here is the reputation system, which we don't really know a lot about. I actually do need to make a TheoryCraft video about reputation because I do have some thoughts on that, but that's for a little bit later. I really do like the idea that we can actually be contractors for the UEE, which means we can pick up quests for the UEE and hopefully through an RPG type of system in which we actually get some background story while earning reputation, we can actually get some really good gameplay out of it. But I'm really glad that there's already thoughts about laying this groundwork down so that we can actually have gameplay that interacts directly with the UEE.
With 4 supergiants that are all owned by individual corporations and all run their own individual security, is the stand system still policed by the UEE? I mean,
Yes.
it's still considered
it's still a UEE system, and so yeah, they're kind of militarily responsible for the space in between the planetary zones.
Which is pretty normal. Normally, like, advocacy is handling the interplanetary crimes that happen in a system. So the same is here, but they're really trying to limit how much resources they make available to the system. They're telling the companies, you should be handling this. That was the whole point in selling these. And some of the planetary governments want there to be more, and some of them want there to be less oversight. And so it's kind of an ongoing debate between these 4 governing bodies.
And where I want to go with this one is that we know CIG wants to have command and control spaceship, and we really don't know what type of command and control we can actually do. And keep in mind that since we're actually players and we have different ways to be able to communicate, a lot of command and control can actually be done outside the video game, which is not something that the video game maker wants, but they're going to have to deal with that because that's just the reality of the matter. What they can have large organizations do is that if they actually have a big military fleet, they actually need authorizations in order to pass through a certain area or to actually station a fleet within that region. So in other words, if you're going to be out in the middle of space, you're going to need authorizations with the UE to actually sit a battle fleet in that particular area. When you actually want to go to ArcCorp, you're going to have to get authorization to move that fleet into the ArcCorp area because that's what's normally done right now in the real world. That way it actually limits the movement of large fleets, thereby making large fleet combat a little bit more strategic and a little bit more interesting, in which case only the higher ups within organizations like the CEO or whatever can actually command a fleet to go there. And if a fleet actually goes into a space in which they're not authorized to do, they automatically become an enemy of whatever region that is. So even if they do it for the right reasons, if they actually don't get permission, they're still going to be on the wrong side of the law, in which case ArcCorp can involve the UEE, and UEE would side with the territory to kick you back out or to destroy you and whatnot. So this is something that can really tie back to command and control and also the hierarchy of organizations. That could be one of the reasons why we need command and control capital ships and space stations and all of that stuff. So just an idea to throw out there.
So for low end, less brand name restaurants, if maybe a focus on vending machines, more automated services, more name brand stores, fewer live people, more terminals or automation. Stores tend to sell multiple types of things, and then of course the realization that we've had Kelto sitting there for years, and maybe this is where we finally pull the trigger on that. And then of course you have follow-up notes for design. We got to follow up with them and get their requirements, like what are they envisioning happens in a low end station, because the tail doesn't always wag the dog here.
No, yeah, totally. And again, with all this stuff, it's it's a process of like we kind of bounce ideas. They go yes, no. How about this? We go, sweet, that's cool, and incorporate it in and bounce it around, and just sort of around the round.
Drop off points, economy of selling stuff. Do they need places to sleep? Limited repair and refuel. Okay, let's keep going down, JJ. Revel in York can art support a visual aesthetic with their work. Because the Revel in York hangars were developed quite a long time ago, and I think they were actually done with part of that work was done by Behavior at that time.
Yes.
So different team working on stuff today. Emphasize closing non-critical shops, clothing stores, hair salons, medical facilities. Would these have rooms for rent? Proprietary brands, would they have high-end associations? More windows, non-critical spaces. This is where I think you really hit on things. Sunrooms for plants, art galleries, sculptures. I would love to see an art gallery.
So that was the end of the episode. I tried to cut it down to the most interesting things for that particular episode. If you listened all the way to the end, please give me a feedback on whether or not you like that. Was it too long? Was it too short? Too much detail? Not enough detail? Should I go ahead and elaborate a little bit more on what I was thinking, or should I just be a little bit more shorter? Please let me know, and I will continue to improve upon this particular type of video.
I'll sell it. You guys don't have to sell it. I'll sell it. That's what I'm here for. I'm the shill. I'm the shill.